The Great Plains are buried under a white silence. Snow falls in thick, relentless sheets, turning roads into rivers of ice. A yellow school bus struggles along a narrow country road, its engine coughing, its tires spinning hopelessly in the drifts. Inside 20 children and their teacher, shivering breath fogging the windows. The heater has failed. The storm is closing in. Miles away behind the wire fences of a German POW camp, a guard makes his morning rounds. And in the distance, through the swirling snow, a shape catches his eye. A bus tilted at an angle, half buried. Among the prisoners, one man steps forward. A former Wehrmacht engineer, his name barely remembered now. He sees the danger not as an enemy, but as a father, as a soldier trained for survival. He asks for a length of rope. The guard laughs, calling it a stupid trick. But minutes later, the German begins to tie knots precise, practiced, efficient. That stupid rope trick will soon pull the children in the bus from the jaws of a frozen death. But to understand how a German prisoner ended up saving American lives, we must return to the strange world of wartime Nebraska. By early 1944, the world was burning. Across Europe, the Allied armies were pushing toward the Atlantic Wall, preparing for the largest invasion in history, Operation Overlord. In the Pacific, U.S. Marines were clawing their way island by island toward Japan. Every ton of food, every bullet, every gallon of fuel was essential to keeping the war machine alive. Back home, America's industrial might was at its breaking point. With over 12 million men and women serving overseas, farms and factories faced a crisis no one had expected: a shortage of hands. Fields went untilled. Fruit rotted on the trees. Rural states like Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa felt the blow hardest. That's when the U.S. War Department made an unusual decision, one born not from trust but necessity. If American men were fighting abroad, then captured enemy soldiers would work at home. Between 1943 and 1945, nearly 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic, most of them German, some Italian, a few Japanese. They were scattered among 660 camps across the United States. Nebraska, a landlocked state of cornfields and wide skies, would host 12 of them. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment for POWs, and America largely obeyed. Prisoners were paid a small wage, given shelter, food, and the right to send mail home, a luxury their own regime often denied captured Allied soldiers. In the heart of the Midwest, trains began to unload thousands of young German men, some still teenagers, others grizzled veterans of the Afrika Korps or the Eastern Front. They stepped off boxcars wearing faded field gray uniforms, faces weary and sunburned from captivity in North Africa. Farmers watched in silence as the men marched past the enemy, now walking down their main streets. The camps were built quickly. Rows of wooden barracks, guard towers at each corner, and a perimeter of barbed wire that glistened like frost under the Nebraska sun. Each camp was overseen by a small detachment of American soldiers, often older reservists or men unfit for overseas duty. Inside the fences, daily life followed strict order. Roll call at dawn, inspections, work assignments, mail delivery. The prisoners worked in nearby canneries, beet fields, and sawmills, earning 80 cents a day, money they could spend in the camp's small store. Some guards viewed them as dangerous fanatics. Others saw something else: weary young men, far from home, stripped of their cause but still clinging to dignity. One Nebraska farmer later recalled, "They were polite, efficient, and grateful for work. You'd never know they were the enemy unless you saw the fence." At first, fear ran deep. Rumors spread through towns that the Germans were spies, saboteurs, or unrepentant Nazis. Parents warned their children to stay away from the fence. Local newspapers debated whether it was right to let Hitler's men walk free in America's fields. But over time, something shifted. The POWs were careful, disciplined, and, to the surprise of many, respectful. They played soccer on Sundays, carved toys for local children, and sang Christmas hymns through the wire. Farmers began to see results: their crops harvested, their barns repaired, their produce delivered on time. The war's burden lightened, one field at a time. The lines blurred between enemy and worker, between captive and neighbor. For the German prisoners, the American Midwest was a strange world, open, vast, and eerily peaceful. Gone were the bombed cities and ruined villages of Europe. In Nebraska, the horizon stretched endlessly. The wind carried the scent of corn, diesel, and freedom. Many POWs kept diaries. In one recovered journal from a German held at Camp Atlanta, Nebraska, he wrote, "Here, the people stare at us, but not with hate. Perhaps they do not understand war as we do. Perhaps that is why they will win it." Yet even amid this fragile peace, the war's shadow remained. Barbed wire fenced off the prairie. Guards watched from towers. Letters home were censored. The men were free to work, but never to leave. Still, humanity has a way of slipping through cracks, even those lined with steel. And in one of those camps, on a cold Nebraska morning, a German prisoner would one day step forward and use his wartime knowledge not for destruction, but for salvation. Nestled between fields of winter wheat and endless sky, the Geneva prisoner of war camp looked almost ordinary from a distance. Just rows of wooden huts, a water tower, a few guard posts. But inside, behind its triple layer of barbed wire, lived over 3,000 German soldiers, men who had once fought under the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, the Afrika Korps, and the Wehrmacht. For many of them, the war was already over. Captured in North Africa or Sicily, shipped across oceans in guarded convoys, they now woke to the smell of bacon drifting from the American mess hall and the hum of trucks on the highway. They were safe, fed, and perhaps most surprisingly respected. Every morning began with a Pell roll call. The prisoners would line up in formation, boots crunching over gravel, answering their numbers in clipped German accents. Afterward, groups were assigned to local farms or factories. By 7 a.m., convoys of military trucks were already rolling through the countryside, each truck carrying a dozen POWs and an armed guard. They would be dropped off at farms miles apart, working under the watchful but often casual eyes of American civilians. Inside the camp, those not assigned to labor ran a small world of their own. A library stocked with donated books, a soccer league, even a makeshift orchestra. Some taught English lessons to each other, others sketched, carved, or wrote letters home to a Germany they no longer recognized. Life was regimented but bearable. The Geneva Convention ensured food, shelter, and minimal dignity, a concept that stood in sharp contrast to what Allied prisoners endured in Nazi camps across Europe. Here lay one of the strangest paradoxes of the Second World War. Men who had once fought to enslave nations now helping to feed America. Nebraska farmers, many of whom had lost sons to the war, found themselves giving orders to German soldiers. Yet, in the rhythm of daily work, something quietly changed. Stories circulated of guards sharing cigarettes with prisoners, of local families sneaking bread and apples to the men. One farmer near Hastings later recalled, "They worked hard, never complained. When the war ended, I almost missed them." In the heart of enemy territory, decency persisted. Humanity, fragile, unspoken, grew between people who should have hated each other. Among the prisoners in Geneva was one man whose name survived the fog of time, Heinrich Karl Schreiber. Born in Bavaria in 1912, Schreiber had been an engineer before the war. Drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940, he served with a logistics unit in North Africa, not as a frontline soldier, but as a builder, problem solver, and mechanic. Captured by the British at El Alamein in 1942, he was handed over to the Americans the following year and eventually sent to the Geneva, Nebraska POW camp. Fellow prisoners described him as quiet but clever. He repaired broken tools with scrap wire, built small wooden toys for the guards' children, and was known for his odd sense of humor. His friends often teased him about his obsession with little tricks, knots, pulleys, and field improvisations he had learned during engineering training. To them, it was harmless, almost comical, the stupid rope tricks of a man trying to keep busy behind the wire. They didn't know that one of those tricks would one day save a bus full of American children. The people of Geneva lived with the camp as part of their landscape. Children rode bicycles along the fence line, waving at the enemy. Women hung laundry while hearing faint songs in German drift across the fields. The war felt far away, yet its prisoners were just down the road. Some locals admitted curiosity, others fear. "We thought they were all Nazis," one Nebraska woman recalled decades later. "Then we saw them playing violins on Sundays." That uneasy coexistence between fear and familiarity would define Nebraska's wartime years. By 1944, the POWs had become an accepted presence, working in fields, clearing roads, building barns. And as that winter deepened, the same German hands that had built fortifications in Tunisia were now stacking hay in American barns to keep livestock alive through the snow. No one could have imagined that one of these men, a captured engineer from Bavaria, would soon face a moment of choice that would define his captivity and perhaps his life. In a land of fences and silence, Heinrich Schreiber's hands had once built for war. But in the freezing Nebraska winter, they were about to build something else entirely, a bridge between enemies. Inside every prisoner's barrack, under the thin army blankets and rationed cigarettes, lay the same question: what am I now? For many of the German POWs in Nebraska, the war had stripped away the ideals that once filled their uniforms. They were soldiers without a cause, men who had once marched for the Reich and now tilled foreign soil under the eyes of their enemies. For Heinrich Schreiber, that question weighed heavier than most. He had not been a Nazi zealot, at least not in the way the word would later come to define evil. Like many in the Wehrmacht, he had been an engineer before he was a soldier, drawn into war by duty and survival rather than conviction. Yet in captivity, the guilt of association never left him. Heinrich kept to himself. He avoided arguments, avoided the loud nationalists who still saluted when the guards weren't watching. His solace was found in small acts of creation, repairing, building, tinkering with rope and wood, as if every knot and pulley were a quiet defiance against the destruction he once helped sustain. At night, in the cold barracks, he would stare through the narrow window slit at the dark Nebraska plains. He sometimes thought of his own son, back in Bavaria, barely old enough for school when he last saw him. And when he thought of that, he would stop working with his hands, fold them quietly, and whisper a prayer. He did not know that just miles away, another group of children, American, loud and free, would soon depend on those same hands to live. To the people of Nebraska, the war felt far away, and yet every morning it passed right through their fields. Military trucks rattled down country roads, carrying German POWs in the back, young men with sunken faces and wool caps pulled over their ears. Farmers watched them climb down from the trucks and begin work among the rows of sugar beets or wheat. Armed guards stayed at a distance, more as formality than protection. What began as wary tolerance slowly evolved into something else. Many Nebraskans were the children or grandchildren of German immigrants. They recognized the accent, the songs, even the recipes the POWs talked about. The line between enemy and neighbor began to blur. A farmer's wife in Fillmore County recalled decades later, "They reminded me of my own brothers. Some of them couldn't have been older than 19. The prisoners worked diligently, grateful for fair treatment. They took pride in the efficiency of their labor. And for the locals, exhausted by years of shortages and the absence of their own sons, that work mattered." In town, opinion softened. People still locked their doors, but not their hearts. Children would wave as trucks passed. Sometimes, guards looked the other way while locals handed out apples or coffee to the men through the slats of the truck bed. Evening by evening, the sound of German songs drifted over the cornfields, soft, melodic, far from the battlefields of Europe. It wasn't forgiveness. It was familiarity. A human recognition that war had made enemies of men who in another life might have shared a fence line, or traded tools, or watched their children play together. The Geneva camp became a strange mirror reflecting both the best and worst of humanity in wartime. Inside, the POWs tried to keep their discipline and dignity. Outside, Americans learned that not every man in gray was a monster. And in the middle stood Heinrich Schreiber, the quiet engineer who fixed what was broken, from tools to toys, from ropes to relationships. He had earned a reputation among the guards as Der Bastler, the tinkerer. When equipment failed, they called him. When something mechanical puzzled them, he found a way. His mind, trained for efficiency, sought order amid chaos. That would be his salvation, and one day the salvation of others. But before that winter's fateful storm, Schreiber would have to face something deeper than cold or captivity. A chance to act not as a prisoner or soldier, but simply as a human being. By late 1944, Nebraska's winters had grown harsh. Snow piled high across empty roads. Fuel was rationed, and old school buses struggled through frost-bitten mornings. And as blizzards rolled in, one of those yellow buses would become a trap, an accidental coffin for 20 children and a teacher. When the wind rose that morning, no one imagined that the only man who could save them was one wearing the uniform of their enemy. In every army, the difference between life and death often lies in the hands of engineers, the quiet minds who build bridges, rig pulleys, and solve the unsolvable with what little they have. The Wehrmacht had trained its soldiers in such ingenuity since the 1930s. Known as Feldingenieur or field engineers, these men were expected to think fast under pressure. To move tanks across rivers, recover trucks from mud, lift heavy loads with little more than rope, wood, and leverage. It was in that world that Heinrich Karl Schreiber had learned his craft. Among the drills taught during his training was one dismissed by most as impractical, a simple rope rig known as the Flaschenzugtrick, or bottle pull. It was a low-friction pulley system that could multiply a man's strength 3 or 4 times using just loops, knots, and tension angles. The trick was basic physics mechanical advantage, but its beauty lay in its simplicity. A single rope, if looped and anchored correctly, could free a vehicle from snow, mud, or sand without brute force. Schreiber had once used it in Tunisia, pulling a supply truck out of desert sand under enemy fire. He remembered the jeers from fellow soldiers. "Your stupid rope tricks again, Schreiber." But the truck had moved, and the convoy survived. In Nebraska, years later, that same muscle memory, the same stupid trick would return. Inside the Geneva POW camp, Schreiber kept busy repairing farm tools and vehicles. The guards often joked that he could fix anything short of the weather. He requested scraps of rope and wire, testing knots during his free time, perhaps to keep his hands from idling, perhaps to remind himself he still had purpose. To an engineer, captivity was intolerable because it meant uselessness. Building something anything was a quiet form of freedom. He once told a fellow prisoner, "If your hands are working, your mind is not in prison." That sentence would echo on a day when no one else could act quickly enough. By 1944, the line between captor and captive in Nebraska had blurred into something human. Guards trusted their prisoners enough to let them work unsupervised. Local families brought the Germans hot meals on Christmas Eve. They were enemies on paper, but in practice, men who shared hunger, cold, and a longing for home. Yet, moral walls still stood. The Germans were the others. They wore numbers, not names. Their fences reminded everyone that kindness had its limits. For the prisoners, that fence was more than wire, it was identity. It told them they were less, even when they acted decently. And for Heinrich Schreiber, that quiet humiliation never left. He knew he had served a regime that brought suffering. He knew the world saw him as an invader, a criminal, a faceless cog in Hitler's machine. But inside, he was simply a man, a father, a builder, a thinker. So when the moment came when he saw a yellow school bus stranded in the storm, filled with frightened children, his instinct was not political. It was human. The blizzard that struck Fillmore County in January 1944 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. Visibility vanished. The land turned to white oblivion. From his work detail near the highway, Schreiber could barely make out shapes beyond the falling snow. But then he heard it, the faint, desperate sound of a motor, straining and failing. A school bus, half buried in snow, its wheels spinning. Inside, 20 American children and their teacher trapped in the cold. The wind howled louder than their voices. The guards hesitated. The storm was too dangerous. Radios were down. Roads impassable. Schreiber stepped forward. He gestured to the stranded vehicle, then to the rope coiled on the supply sled beside him. The guard shook his head. "It's too risky." Schreiber insisted, miming the same gestures he had once used in North Africa. After a pause, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of trust, the guard relented. Within minutes, Schreiber and two other prisoners waded through waist-deep snow toward the stranded bus. He studied the slope, the angle of the tires, the frozen mud beneath. Then he began tying knots. A loop here, an anchor there, precise, deliberate, practiced. He tied one end to the bus axle, the other to a wooden post, threading it through 3 loops to create tension. The rope tightened like a drawn bow. "Pull!" he shouted in broken English. With each heave, the bus groaned, wheels gaining grip, inching forward. Children pressed against the frosted glass, eyes wide. On the third pull, the axle lurched free. The bus rolled onto firmer ground. The stupid rope trick had worked. The guard, half stunned, half frozen, could only watch. And somewhere in that frozen Nebraska silence, something deeper shifted not just the bus, but the invisible boundary between enemy and savior. As the bus drove away, the teacher waved through the window. The German prisoner, rope still in hand, breath clouding in the cold, simply nodded. He would later return to camp, rope over his shoulder, his uniform soaked through, saying nothing. But word spread. The guards told the officers. The officers told the townsfolk. By sundown, everyone in Geneva knew. The man they once called the enemy had saved their children. From that day forward, locals referred to him differently. Not as Der Deutsch, the German, but as the engineer. And for the rest of his captivity, whenever something broke, a pump, a pipe, a truck, they called for him. The man with the rope. When war strips men of purpose, sometimes compassion restores it. And for Heinrich Schreiber, a single rope became more than a tool. It became proof that even in the age of total war, a single act of humanity could pull the world, inch by inch, back onto solid ground. The morning began gray and silent, the kind of silence that warns of snow. In rural Fillmore County, Nebraska, the air was sharp enough to bite the lungs. By dawn, the wind picked up, and by mid-morning, the sky had turned white. It wasn't a gentle snowfall, it was a storm. A full whiteout. At 7:15 a.m., a yellow school bus belonging to District 8 left the small town of Geneva. The driver, a local mechanic named Carl Jensen, had made the route hundreds of times before. 20 children climbed aboard that morning, bundled in wool coats and mittens. Their teacher, Miss Eleanor Thorne, rode along, checking names with numb fingers. No one thought twice about the dark horizon to the west. The forecast had called for flurries, not fury. By 8:30 a.m., visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. The wind screamed across open farmland, slicing through trees and fences. The bus crawled forward, its tires skidding on the frozen road. Snow piled high against the sides, rising like walls. At 8:45 a.m., the engine sputtered. Jensen cursed softly, pumping the gas. Nothing. The wheels spun uselessly in the snow. The bus shuddered, tilted, and stopped. They were stranded. Inside, the temperature fell fast. Children began to cry. Miss Thorne tried to calm them, handing out scarves and mittens, pressing small bodies close for warmth. Jensen stepped outside, instantly swallowed by the storm. He could barely see the road, let alone the horizon. They were miles from town, and the nearest farmhouse was out of sight. He tried again and again to dig the tires free with a spade, but the snow kept filling in faster than he could clear it. His fingers bled through his gloves. By 9:30 a.m., frost began forming on the windows inside. The heater had long failed. The youngest, a boy no older than 6, began to shiver violently. Miss Thorne gathered the children into the aisle, wrapping them in coats, whispering stories over the howling wind. She prayed someone would see them. A mile away, in the work detail assigned to clear nearby roads, the German prisoners were fighting the same storm. Among them Heinrich Karl Schreiber, rope coiled at his belt, face hidden beneath a wool cap marked PW. He saw the bus before anyone else did, a faint yellow blur against the white. He squinted through the wind. The angle of the vehicle was wrong. The front end half buried, and the exhaust wasn't rising. He shouted to the guard in halting English bus, "Stuck! Kinder! Children!" The guard followed his gaze and froze. It was impossible. How could anyone be on the road in this weather? But then, faintly, through the storm, came a sound. A horn, pressed again and again, weak and failing. Without waiting for permission, Schreiber grabbed a rope from the sled and started running. The snow came at him sideways, sharp as glass. Every step sank to his knees. The cold burned his lungs. The guard shouted something behind him, but the wind drowned it out. Another prisoner followed Otto Müller, a young man from Bremen, carrying the other end of the rope. When they reached the bus, Schreiber could see faces pressed against the fogged glass, terrified children staring back at the sight of two Germans in gray coats. He banged on the door. Jensen opened it an inch, gunmetal eyes cautious, frozen breath spilling out. Schreiber shouted over the wind, "Rope! We help!" The driver hesitated. Then he saw the rope, the mechanical precision of Schreiber's knots, and something in his instinct took over. He stepped aside. Schreiber looped one end of the rope under the rear axle, his fingers moving fast despite the cold. He dug his boots into the snow, tying anchor knots to a fence post and to the camp sled, now wedged deep for leverage. The rope stretched tight as a steel cable. He turned to Jensen and shouted, "Now drive! Slowly!" The engine coughed to life. The wheels spun. The bus didn't move. Schreiber readjusted the angle, feeding the rope through a makeshift pulley made of a broken fence rail. He shifted the line's tension once, twice. Then, with a guttural shout, he and Otto heaved together. The bus lurched forward. The tires caught. Another pull. Another groan. And then movement. The bus climbed free from the drift, rolling onto the road like a giant beast shaking off snow. The children cheered inside, the sound muffled by the storm. Schreiber stood back, chest heaving, rope frozen stiff in his hands. When it was done, Miss Thorne stepped down from the bus, snow clinging to her coat. She looked at the man in the gray uniform, the same kind she had seen in newsreels on posters, the uniform of the enemy. But here, in this white wasteland, he was just a man who had saved her children. She reached out a hand. Schreiber hesitated, then shook it. Her eyes glistened. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Children safe. That was all. Then he turned back toward the blinding snow, rope over his shoulder, walking silently behind the guard's silhouette until both disappeared into the storm. That afternoon, when the sky finally cleared, the story spread like wind through the county. A German prisoner, an enemy of the United States, had saved a bus full of Nebraska schoolchildren using nothing but a rope and his wits. And for the first time, many locals realized the truth. Humanity doesn't wear uniforms. When the storm passed, Nebraska awoke to silence. The sky had turned an unbroken blue, the kind that only comes after destruction, calm, almost unreal. Snow lay thick across the fields, sculpted into white dunes that swallowed fence posts and silos alike. In the town of Geneva, people emerged from their homes cautiously, faces wrapped in scarves, boots crunching over ice. They expected damaged downed lines, frozen pipes, stranded cars. What they didn't expect was the story that met them by mid-morning. It came first, from a breathless farmhand who had seen the school bus crawl into town, its sides crusted with ice, its windows fogged by the warmth of 20 living children. "The Germans pulled it out," he said, barely believing his own words. Within hours, the news reached the sheriff's office, the local paper, and most uncomfortably the Geneva POW camp itself. By 10 a.m., an official report landed on the desk of Captain Robert L. Anderson, the camp's commanding officer. He read it twice. Prisoner number 12,375, Heinrich Karl Schreiber, left assigned work area during blizzard. Acted without explicit order. Assisted civilians in distress. Returned to camp voluntarily. No breach of security observed. Military regulations demanded punishment. Leaving a designated work area even to save lives was technically an escape attempt. But this was no ordinary case, and Anderson knew it. He summoned the guards who had been present. They stood stiffly before him, hats in hand. Did he try to flee? Anderson asked. "No, sir," one replied. He went straight to the bus, came right back, and he helped. Yes, sir, saved the whole lot of them. Kids, a teacher. Without him, they'd have frozen. The captain leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. In a war defined by orders, here was a man who had broken one for mercy. Anderson signed the paper quietly, adding a final line: "No disciplinary action. Conduct commendable." Then he slipped the file into a drawer. Some things, he thought, didn't belong in bureaucracy. By afternoon, the story had reached every house in Geneva. The children, trembling but alive, told their parents how the German with the rope had come through the snow. Miss Thorne, the teacher, gave her account to the Geneva Signal newspaper that evening. Her words were simple: "He risked his life for ours. We owe him more than we can say." That line would appear in the paper 2 days later, tucked between war headlines from Europe. In coffee shops and church basements, the talk was the same. Could it be true? A German saved our children? Some refused to believe it. Others, quietly, admitted respect. At the small Lutheran church on 9th Street, Pastor Miller spoke to his congregation the following Sunday. "Perhaps we are meant to see that God's image can shine through even an enemy's uniform." That same Sunday morning, Schreiber sat on his bunk, polishing his boots. His rope, the one he had used in the storm, hung coiled on a nail above his bed. He had not been punished, but neither had he been praised. No one had spoken to him beyond brief orders. The guards treated him as they always did, perhaps with a faint nod of respect, perhaps with quiet discomfort. He didn't expect thanks. He hadn't acted for it. But when the mail came that week, there was an envelope with no return address, just the words "to the German who helped." Inside was a short note, written in careful cursive: "You saved our children. We prayed for your family that night. God bless you." And beneath it, 20 signatures in a child's handwriting. Schreiber folded the note, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and kept it there until the day he left Nebraska. Captain Anderson, though he never admitted it, wrestled with what had happened. He had spent years viewing his prisoners as potential threats, trained soldiers of a ruthless army. But now he saw something else: a man whose instinct had been not to escape, but to save. He recorded the event quietly in the camp's daily log. Incident: January 17, 1944. Severe blizzard. POW number 12,375 assisted local civilians. Outcome positive. The report would be filed, forgotten by most. But for Anderson, it changed the way he looked at the men behind the wire. He later told a colleague, "If that man's my enemy, I'd hate to meet my friend." In the weeks that followed, the rescued children returned to school. Life went on, rationing, chores, telegrams from the front. But some carried a quiet memory of that day. One of them, Alice Jensen, the driver's daughter, would later recall in an interview from the 1980s. "I remember his hands red from the cold holding the rope. I didn't know what a German was. I only knew he wasn't afraid." For her and for many others, the image of that moment stayed long after the snow melted. A faceless prisoner behind barbed wire had become a symbol of something far larger: the stubborn persistence of humanity, even when nations forgot it. When spring came and the fields thawed, the rope was still there, hung quietly in the camp workshop, its fibers stiff with salt and frost. It had been a tool once used for war, for moving tanks and building defenses. Now it was a relic of peace, a reminder that mercy can be stronger than orders, and that a single act of courage can melt the hardest walls of hate. From that day, guards no longer called Schreiber by his number. They called him by name. And when the work trucks rolled out each morning, one of them always carried the man with the rope. Spring 1944 melted Nebraska's snow into mud. The fields filled with the smell of thawed earth and diesel, and the barbed wire around the Geneva POW camp gleamed under a softer sun. Life returned to rhythm. Trucks left each morning, bringing work details to farms and rail yards. Prisoners lined up for roll call. Guards smoked and leaned on their rifles. The war in Europe still raged: Cassino, Normandy, the Eastern Front, but here, in the middle of America, it was all distant thunder. And yet, within those fences, something had changed. The story of the German with the rope had spread quietly through the camp. No one spoke of it in official briefings, but the prisoners knew. Even those who still held to Nazi pride looked at Schreiber differently now. Some with respect, others with confusion that a man could choose compassion over loyalty to uniform. Schreiber himself said little. He still worked the same long hours, fixing engines, tying knots, repairing whatever broke. But in the evenings when others played chess or sang, he would take out the folded note from the children 20 shaky signatures and read it again by lantern light. He had become, without intending it, a symbol of something the war could not destroy: the quiet power of decency. Captain Anderson never sent the incident up the chain of command. He feared Washington would see it as a security breach, a guard letting a POW act unsupervised during a storm. But the local Red Cross representative learned of it through the newspaper report. Weeks later, Anderson received a letter from the office of the Provost Marshal General requesting clarification. His reply was brief and careful. The prisoner acted in the presence of U.S. personnel. No escape attempt, no political motivation. Civilian lives preserved through prompt action. Conduct exemplary. The letter was filed, stamped, and forgotten, buried in Washington archives among thousands of other wartime reports. No medal, no commendation, no ceremony followed. But for a man in captivity, silence was often the highest form of recognition. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned. Allied troops were closing in on Germany from both fronts. Rumors of collapse reached even the POW camps. Some prisoners felt hope not for victory but for an end. Others felt dread for what awaited them at home. The Geneva camp's German library now stocked American newspapers, and Schreiber often read them slowly, tracing the headlines about cities he once knew: Munich, Cologne, Nuremberg. When the news of Hitler's death reached Nebraska in May 1945, the camp fell silent. No celebrations, no shouts. Just quiet. For the Americans, it was triumph. For the Germans, it was disorientation, the end of everything they had once believed unshakable. Captain Anderson called for an assembly that day. He stood before thousands of POWs and said simply, "The war in Europe is over. You are now men without enemies." In the following months, repatriation began. POWs were processed, registered, and shipped east for return to Europe. Many left behind carved boxes, paintings, even friendships that had survived the fences. When Heinrich Schreiber's name was called in October 1945, he packed the few things he owned: a small notebook, a pocket knife, and the folded letter from the schoolchildren. As he boarded the truck that would take him to the rail depot, Captain Anderson approached. The officer extended his hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Schreiber asked, puzzled. "For reminding us what kind of men we should be." Schreiber nodded once, eyes lowered. Then he climbed aboard. The truck pulled away down the gravel road, the fence receding behind him, sunlight flickering through the trees. He never saw Nebraska again. But the people of Geneva never forgot. In that small town, whenever the wind howled across the plains and snow drifted over the old roads, someone would tell the story of the German prisoner, the one who tied a rope, braved a blizzard, and saved their children. A story that crossed the wire. When Heinrich Karl Schreiber stepped off the transport ship in Bremen in late 1946, Germany was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, twisted metal, hollow shells, streets lined with rubble where neighborhoods had once stood. The Reich he had served, the Führer he had saluted, the flag he had marched under, all gone. Heinrich walked through what had been his hometown in Bavaria and found little standing. His parents' house had been bombed. His wife and son had fled to a nearby village. When he finally found them weeks later, his son, now 11, barely recognized him. He had left as a soldier of an empire. He returned as a man stripped of all illusions. To many former POWs, captivity in America had been a humiliation. But for Schreiber, it had been a quiet education, proof that the enemy was not what propaganda had painted. In Nebraska, he had seen kindness, fairness, even trust. It was not a new ideology he brought home, but something simpler: the belief that goodness could exist without uniform, language, or flag. He would live by that belief for the rest of his days. In the spring of 1947, a letter arrived at the post office in Schreiber's small Bavarian village. The envelope bore an American stamp, creased and yellowed from travel. It was from Geneva, Nebraska. Inside, written in neat cursive, was a familiar name: Eleanor Thorne, the teacher from the bus. "We think of you often," she wrote. "Our schoolhouse stands because you were there that day. The children have grown, but they remember. I hope you and your family are safe." Attached was a photograph: 20 smiling children in front of the same school bus, the number still faintly visible on its hood. On the back, "To Mr. Schreiber from the children you saved." Heinrich kept the photo in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. A few years later, another letter followed, this one from Alice Jensen, the driver's daughter. She was 16 now, her handwriting round and confident. "I'm old enough to understand what you did. My father says, heroes don't always wear our flag. I think he's right." For a man once taught that Americans were enemies, the letters felt like sunlight after years of fog. They became proof that even when the world divides itself, small acts of courage can outlive the walls built between people. By the 1950s, the Geneva POW camp was gone. The barracks were dismantled, the fences torn down. Cornfields swallowed the land where prisoners once marched in formation. Only faint impressions of gravel roads remained, ghost traces in the soil. But the story of the German with the rope endured, passed down in kitchens and classrooms. For decades, it lived in the margins, told not by generals or historians, but by those who had been children once, watching snow fall outside a fogged bus window. In the 1980s, local historian Clara Denek collected oral histories from Nebraska residents who had lived near the POW camps. One recording captured a voice trembling with age, saying, "He didn't ask for thanks. He just saw kids in trouble. That's all. Sometimes that's what heroism looks like." The story was published in a small regional history journal in 1987. It never reached national headlines, never made it into textbooks. But in Geneva, it remains sacred, a reminder that compassion can exist even in captivity. Heinrich Schreiber died in 1971 at the age of 59. In his will, he left behind modest possessions: tools, books, photographs, and a small box marked Nebraska. Inside were 3 items: a length of frayed rope tied in a precise loop knot, a folded letter signed by 20 children, and a faded photograph of a yellow school bus under a pale American sky. His son later donated those items to a local museum in Bavaria, where they remain today, a quiet testament to a moment when war's boundaries dissolved in the snow. In Geneva, a small plaque now stands near the site of the old POW camp. Its inscription reads, "In gratitude to those who labored here, and to one man whose hands reminded us that mercy has no nation." The rope trick had begun as a field lesson in survival, a mere piece of soldiers' training. But in the white silence of a Nebraska storm, it became something else entirely. A bridge between enemies, and a story of what remains when war ends but humanity does not.